Minor comment just before we begin. If you recall that there's great fascination with the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, cadence to the movement of thought, you're going to understand exactly how these antithetical Ten Commandments have been formulated. So in Marxism, it's not so clearly stated as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but it's a sequence of negations. You have a chain of negations. You're always negating something in the past and then positing the future. What this means is by always having a chain of negations and saying that the methodology proceeds by negation, you can begin to clear away all of the old ideas, all philosophical systems, all morality, and then you can get to a point where they're all leveled out and destroyed, and then you can posit new systems of morality, new societies, new forms of consciousness, so on and so forth. So this document is going to kind of follow on that cadence. It's going to present the commandment, the video, or the commandments. The source they're taken from are the Dennis Prager videos on the Ten Commandments at PragerU. I think they're excellent videos, so go and have a look at those. I take that example of the commandment, and then I take essentially an inversion of it, which needs to negate the old idea, but then which needs to posit a new example, a new set of ideas, a new moral law by which people need to understand and live. So let's go. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So of course here, A, God exists, and B, God is the one who frees you from slavery, from the abuses and the excesses of Pharaoh, who will happily and contentedly use people's lives and labour in order to further his own gains and his own means. So the inversion of this would appear something of the form: heretofore mankind's consciousness has resided in darkness. We have come to the realization that the state of man is one of bondage in being and in consciousness, including spirit. Enlightenment can only be obtained through the secret fires of historicism and dialectical materialism. It is the species which refashions itself and being. Its liberation can only be enacted and made universally real through revolutionary praxis. Okay, so the idea here is that God doesn't even exist, and so whenever you're under the entire framework of the world where the understanding that God exists took place, you're actually already operating in deceit. This is the thing which is underlying this. Now, the substitute becomes clear, so we might as well just start working through the examples. Antecedents to Marx, the furthest in time would probably be the Stoics and their pantheism, where nature and God are essentially synonymous with one another. God is in the world. By an extension, we are part of nature, so there is a divine aspect in the human. This is one old system of pantheism, loosely in the Stoics. The more immediate antecedents to Marx's situation and period in time is really the French Revolution, and you do have Anacharsis Clootz. He's as part of the revolutionary movement. There is this cult of the supreme being and cult of reason that are established during the French Revolution, and you have these interesting principles emerge. So there is one God only, le peuple. So it's God is in the people. By extension, God must be in nature, and likewise we see the influence of Feuerbach. So Feuerbach was a mentor to Marx, and he likewise rejects the idea that there is a transcendent God, and he's then bringing God down into the material world. He's doing so through a criticism of Hegel. Hegel was kind of conserving God in a philosophical sense, finding a philosophical basis for God's existence and generating a God out of humanity. Feuerbach begins to materialize this, and it's ultimately Hegel's system and Feuerbach's materialism that are brought together in the figure of Marx, and Marx who then goes on to materialize Hegel's system comprehensively. So once you understand all of the aspects of Hegel's system, for example, you will understand Marx's. Now, the main idea of Feuerbach is that man is not the issue of God, God is the issue of man, and specifically he looks to psychology, and he explains God as being a psychological projection of some aspect of man's essence. So you've got an aspect within you, or some part of yourself, but instead of recognizing it as part of yourself, heretofore you project it out of you. So you see it as something which is external to yourself, whereas in fact it should be internal. Now, what this leads to is that you're going to need a different kind of source of divinity. I think Feuerbach recognizes that if everybody was trying to reintegrate this and sees themselves as divine, then essentially people's self-concept in the world is that everyone is gods, but ultimately human nature is human nature, and so you would have people warring, but now saying that claiming their divinity or whatever it happened to be. So man by himself is man, but man with man, the unity of I and you, that is God. So Feuerbach materializes divinity, and he roots it in the human collective. And so he later states, the new philosophy takes the place of religion. It has within itself the essence of religion. In truth, it is itself religion. So the idea is that the old theistic systems have been dispensed with. We've now moved to a higher dialectical stage of religion, but this is one in which we're conscious of our embodiment of God, and how we are an aspect of this God. We are one particular extension of this universal being. It's through the collective that we realize this. Now, there's a lot of interesting ideas which happen with Marx when he's in his university years. He goes through a religious crisis. So he already has a bit of background. He was born into a Jewish family, but the faith appears to essentially have lapsed. He's obviously had a lot of education in that area, but as soon as he comes to university, he begins to obviously see the Hegelian system. He's reading people like the Stoics. So he's getting very different ideas. Ultimately, he goes completely with, you'd see the French Revolutionary line, the Feuerbach line, and saying, well, actually, the whole idea of a transcendent God is totally absurd. It needs to be integrated into the material. And so Marx has this religious crisis. At the time, he's looking at people like Cleanthes. So we're looking at, pantheistic ideas. And so Marx states, a curtain had fallen, my holy of holies was rent asunder, and new gods had to be installed. I arrived at the point of seeking the idea in reality itself. If previously the gods had dwelt above the earth, now they became its centre. I had read fragments of Hegel's philosophy, art and science, which had become completely divorced from each other, were to some extent united, and like a vigorous traveller, I set about the task itself, a philosophical dialectical account of divinity as it manifests itself as the idea in itself, as religion, as nature, and as history. My last proposition was the beginning of the Hegelian system. This work, my dearest child reared by moonlight, like a false siren delivers me into the arms of the enemy. So Marx, speaking of Hegel, states that the subject knowing itself as absolute self-consciousness is therefore God, and the idea is merely that the person knowing itself as this absolute self-consciousness is therefore God. That can be materialized, which is what I argue that Marx does to Hegel's system, and therefore the aspect of divinity in the collective, in the natural world, now carries across and underpins Marx's system. Now, of course, if you were looking at this more from the Christian perspective, then you would be saying that the enemy of God is essentially Lucifer, and the problem which pantheism can establish is that you can self-deify. You can see yourself as part of the deity. If I, for example, am a pantheist, I see myself as being one expression of divinity, and the wider world being an expression of divinity. If somebody's doing something in the wider world that I dislike, then that might qualify as sin to me, and it might be a moral duty for me to then punish them. Obviously, this can be an extremely chaotic situation. So Marx then states, communism begins from the outset with atheism, but atheism is at first far from being communism. Indeed, it is still mostly an abstraction. So the atheism is an intermediary state. For Marx, atheism is a means of negating God, but this negation of God is a means of then establishing humanity with its reintegrated divinity. This is why he calls for a confirmation of the true essence being the materialist essence, the thing which was, as far as Marx is concerned, was revealed in the reflection that was God, but it was merely a reflection. What it was reflecting was the material world, the self, the real, the physical. So the consequences really of Marx's system are that humanity begins to embody material divinity. And you can see this explicitly in his work. So man is the supreme being for man. There's nothing ambiguous there. Nature is man's inorganic body. Physical and spiritual life is linked to nature. So we've got this preservation of spiritual life in spite of Marx's system being materialist. That's a little bit puzzling. But once you understand it through the lens of man having reintegrated divinity and then sharing a body as conscious substance, and the wider world as your inorganic body, so unconscious substance, these two things connected with one another materially and by spirit. So one of the key things to recognize, the terminology that Marx uses in his work is species being. So species being is at one and the same time dualistic. It refers to the human species. It refers to being, as in nature, the world, the universe, the materiality in which everything takes place. But species being is likewise a singular entity. So you've got a monad, which also has a dual expression, and then everything cascades down from there. It's kind of like in a sense, it's an allusion to God and then the Trinity as well. Okay, so we've got, yes, he is nature. So this is the aspect where you've got that complete union between humanity and nature, species and being, the species being. So nature remains good even when she produces monstrosities. You could also read that as humanity remains good even when it produces monstrosities. So it's if you happen to produce something which is incredibly horrifying, it's still fundamentally good because it's the material. Now Mao states, our God is none other than the masses of the Chinese people. Of course, once we've got our understanding of Marx in place, then this logically flows. It's entirely consistent with Marx's framework and system. So we can perhaps compliment Mao on being extremely perceptive of the ideas that are foundational to Marx's system. We obviously understand how the ideas of Marx's system, when put into practice, actually parse themselves out in Russia and China with their horrendous consequences. Now, even in spite of all those horrendous consequences, that over 90 years, 90 million people were killed in Soviet Russia, Maoist China, under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, in Vietnam, Cuba, many other places. In spite of all of the horror and death and the production of monstrosities, you then have Derrida, who is in the philosophy of praxis. He's in the dialectical materialist tradition. He comes many years after Marx, but he draws on Marx's methodology and then attaches many other philosophies into Marx's system, and develops his own ideas on language and how language should reflect this base material aspect. So you're wanting to get rid of books and abstract writing and instead return people to the spoken word and the drawing of pictures, of like physical objects, so like drawing cats and dogs, but not necessarily having the word cat or dog as cursive script, because that's the pathway to abstraction and logic, which he dislikes. Anyway, that's a side note. Derrida, even after all the horror and destruction states of Marx's system, and whether we like it or not, whatever consciousness we have of it, we cannot not be its heirs. And so the double negative is that he must be its heirs, that he is the collective, the post-structuralists, they must inherit Marx's system and then develop it. And indeed, that's really what you see on some following pages. He then states, deconstruction has never had any sense or interest except as a radicalization, which is to say also in the tradition of a certain Marxism, in a certain spirit of Marxism. There has been, then, this attempted radicalization of Marxism called deconstruction. So, as clearly as you could possibly state it, Derrida is continuing Marx's project. That's what deconstruction is. For an analysis of what deconstruction is and its methodology, you can obviously go and see my book, The Revolution and Renaissance. So Derrida states, the father, the law, the animal, etc., the sovereign and the beast should one not recognize here basically one and the same thing. The idea there being the collapse of obvious distinctions, but to collapse the distinction between father, law, and animal is to collapse the distinction between God and the snake together. And that's not just something I'm throwing out there. Later in the book, he actually says this explicitly. So, when speaking of the serpent cast out from the Garden of Eden, Derrida then says, because he is in exile, he's a king not exercising power, a king without power, a king dethroned in a sense. Like a king in exile, uncrowned in the underworld, now due to be crowned again. We need to reread the Bible because at bottom, the one to be sorriest for in the whole story is the snake. So the snake is a king who's been dethroned, who's been uncrowned, living in exile. The prodigal son must return, but the snake must return. The snake must return from exile, claim its crown, and we must have pity for the snake. So, of course, in relation to the commandment, what we're saying is that once you've got the understanding of God, this is just an outward projection, and it needs to be reintegrated into the material embodiment of. It needs to be materially embodied and then expressed. Now, at the same time, if God is a deceit, if God is a liar, there's a bit of a weird relationship here where you would think, okay, well, you need to get rid of all of the ideas within Christianity together. If there's no God, how can you say that there's a snake in the Garden of Eden? How can you take ideas such as, the devil, Lucifer, and then start to play with those? But the thing which is being alluded to is that if God is a deceit, is something which is wrong, then perhaps there is knowledge which is hidden in this entity of the snake, which can be then taken and embodied, and that might be the real path to the materialization of divinity and then its embodiment in humanity. So this is where you get the allusion to nature's monstrosities and so on and so forth. Essentially, to look at Lucifer, the snake, the Nimrod, Cain, for example, all of these entities, and to then try and take learning from them, and it's pretty disturbing, but nonetheless, it happens in many places throughout the dialectical tradition. So this essay, this is quoting Haraway now, this essay is an effort to build an ironic political myth faithful to feminism, socialism and materialism, perhaps more faithful as a blasphemy is faithful than as reverent worship and identification. At the centre of my ironic faith, my blasphemy, is the image of the cyborg. So the interesting thing here, of course, is blasphemy is being faithful. Blasphemy would obviously be against God, so you're going to be faithful to the thing which is against God. Of course, we've now got the symbolism of the snake. The snake is even open in Marx's own poetry and creative exploits when in his tragedy Ulanem. So for analysis of that, you can obviously go and look at my book as well. To cut to one of the key points, he has a figure called Beatrice. It's an inversion of Dante's Inferno. Beatrice is referred to as the serpent, and Marx's character Ulanem meets Beatrice, who is a whore, and they come together in their materialist fashion and produce something, and it's then that he obviously generates or goes on to then start generating his system of communism. So the allegorical representation of what he's actually doing in real life is all there. So here, when we're talking about the ironic faith, the blasphemy is the image of the cyborg, and the idea here is that technology is often developed. So you've got intellect, nous, and then you've got the development of knowledge and understanding, testing things through sciences. Technology is developed external to us, and the ultimate development of this pathway is that technology is developed to such a degree that it can be reintegrated into the human body. At that point, you've got a synthesis between technology and earthly matter, and then you're moving beyond it. And then ultimately, if it were possible, we would expect Marxists to attempt to completely transcend the limited material sense, overcome death, and that's what's being referred to here. So the cyborg would not recognize the Garden of Eden. It is not made of mud and cannot dream of returning to dust. Perhaps that is why I want to see if cyborgs can subvert the apocalypse of returning to nuclear dust in the manic compulsion to name the enemy. So, of course, the enemy is God, death, so on and so forth. But if you can attempt to preserve your consciousness in some sort of technological innovation, then you're a cyborg. You've basically outdone God. So that's one of the key ideas here. So the Tower of Babel is Nimrodian construction in collective consciousness. That was just a note I'd made that, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to be a physical construction, but if you have all people speaking the same language, all behind the exact same idea without any deviation, you've essentially got this kind of Tower of Babel in everyone's conception of the world. And here you would have an example where you're trying to use the cyborg to construct the cyborg is a kind of Tower of Babel where you're trying to outdo God's will. You're trying to construct something which is beyond death. And so there's a great irony, really, when you start to look into some of these ideas that, you know, it calls itself humanism, but Marxism is really anti-human. They say that they're materialists, but here we're trying to reject death. So yeah, there's many contradictions in the system. So ultimately, it's a rejection of divinity, but it's a rejection of divinity by trying to integrate it into the self. And so that's the pantheistic aspect. You know, it's been developed sometimes just out of emotion, such as in, you know, the French Revolution, or more out of philosophical roots, such as through, you know, Hegel or Feuerbach. And okay, so it's probably just useful to read it through one more time. So, heretofore, mankind's consciousness has resided in darkness. That's the deceit, that's the lie, that's the lack of understanding, that's the wrong form of logic. We have come to the realization that the state of man is one of bondage in being and in consciousness. So, we've recognized the current state, we're now enlightened, we've got the right form of logic, we're moving through the concepts, we now know that we need to free ourselves. Enlightenment can only be obtained through the secret fires of historicism and dialectical materialism. So obviously you need to have these things if you're going to raise consciousness. So there's an aspect where Marx, for example, claims himself as being, you know, one of the first to really get to the nuts and bolts of this system. So he's the first one to raise consciousness, and then everybody else opts into a system. Their consciousness is raised, and then it kind of cascades through the rest of society. It is the species which refashions itself in being. So that's the end of Marx's system, the species being. That's the Eurobric union between conscious substance and inorganic substance. This is the dualistic aspect of the monad in Marx's system. So, of course, if God doesn't exist, its self-liberation can only be enacted and made universally real through revolutionary practice. You need to overcome God in order to free humanity, because belief in God is itself a kind of slavery, a kind of bondage. And these are the sources that have been used in this video. I hope you've enjoyed it.